Welcome back. Camcorder is finished charging. It's very hot in my apartment. Every day 30 degrees. I forgot to put the heating on this night, but that's not so important because this heating not getting out my apartment again. So let's try to read this history of New York City. I just like to get started, so just read the New York City and New York City area. We need to read about New Jersey state. Read this state next to Connecticut too. I cannot pronounce it. That's a small state next to New York, north of Long Island, called Connecticut. And Pennsylvania state. I think we should read that. And Virginia state, because Virginia is a little bit more south, so maybe there's not so much snow and ice in the winter, and it's north, so there's no alligators. There's no alligators in the water, in the lakes, in the lakes and rivers in Virginia maybe. Because this American alligators should go all the way up north to South Carolina and North Carolina, I think. Because South Carolina and North Carolina, the Atlantic coast, they have some long beaches with water behind the beaches, like in Florida. They have some inland waters, swamp and small saltwater rivers, mix up saltwater and freshwater. And I think you have a lot of alligators down there, big fat American alligators. So if you're living in a boat, if you're living in a small sailboat, you will have big fat alligators in the water. But I'm not living in so maybe Virginia. But this need a better map. No, that's New York and Long Island and New Jersey state. That's New Jersey. Pennsylvania. This is Connecticut. Massachusetts state. We have small states here. So I just need to read this. Maine, New Brunswick. I think that's maybe. No, that's Canada. But Maine is a state. Maine. And this is nothing. That's Caribbean. And that's South America. Nothing to do with this map. No, that's Virginia. This North Carolina up here. I think this river, this swamp, there's alligators into here. And maybe you have alligators in Virginia. Maybe you have a little Virginia Beach. But maybe you only have alligators up this area, only this, and then no alligators there. And you have this big river, and that's more south from New York. I don't know. Of course, I don't need from Denmark, my country. I don't need any visa. I can just travel to United States if I like. I'm living in Denmark. I can just fly to New York if I like. But I think New York is too big. New York City is too big. and it's too expensive. But I think most big cities in United States is very expensive. If you need that hotel room or motel. But this subject, United States, is a very large subject. So I had to start reading somewhere. That was New York City and New York.
History of New York City. The written history of New York City began with the first European explorer, the Italian Giovanni the Verrazzano in 1528. European settlement began with the Dutch in 1608 and New Amsterdam was founded in 1624. The Sons of Liberty campaigned against British authority in New York City, and the Stamp Act Congress of Representatives from throughout the 13 colonies met in the city in 1765 to organize resistance to Crown policies. The city's strategic location and status as a major seaport made it the prime target for British seizure in 1776. General George Washington lost a series of battles from which he narrowly escaped, with the notable exception of the Battle of Harlem Heights, his first victory of the war, and the British Army occupied New York and made it their base on the continent until late 1783, attracting Loyalist refugees. The city served as the national capital under the Articles of Confederation from 1785 to 1789, and briefly served as the new nation's capital in 1789-90 under the United States Constitution. Under the new government, the city hosted the inauguration of George Washington as the first President of the United States, the drafting of the United States Bill of Rights, and the first Supreme Court of the United States. The opening of the Erie Canal, New York and the Great Lakes, along with coastal traffic to Lower New England, making the city the preeminent port on the Atlantic Ocean. The arrival of rail connections to the north and west in the 1840s and 1850s strengthened its central role. Beginning in the mid-19th century, waves of new immigrants arrived from Europe, dramatically changing the composition of the city and serving as workers in the expanding industries. Modern New York traces its development to the consolidation of the 5 boroughs in 1898 and an economic and building boom following the Great Depression and World War II. Throughout its history, New York has served as a main port of entry for many immigrants, and its cultural and economic influence has made it one of the most important urban areas in the United States and the world. The economy in the 1700s was based on farming, local production, fur trading, and Atlantic jobs like shipbuilding. In the 1700s, New York was sometimes referred to as a breadbasket colony, because one of its major crops was wheat. New York colony also exported other goods included iron ore as a raw material and as manufactured goods such as tools, plows, nails and kitchen items such as kettles, pans and pots. Native American settlement, edit. Main article, History of New York City, Prehistory 1664. Prior to the first human settlement, the area that eventually encompassed modern-day New York was originally a marshland swamp, with numerous streams and creeks throughout modern-day Manhattan Island. The first human inhabitants were by the Lenape people. These groups of culturally and linguistically related Native Americans traditionally spoke an Algonquian language now referred to as Unami. Early European settlers called bands of Lenape by the Unami place name for where they lived, such as Raritan in Staten Island and New Jersey, Canarsie in Brooklyn, and Hackensack in New Jersey across the Hudson River from Lower Manhattan. Some modern place names such as Raritan Bay and Canarsie are derived from Lenape names. Eastern Long Island neighbors were culturally and linguistically more closely related to the Mohegan Pequot peoples of New England who spoke the Mohegan Montoplarogonsett language. These peoples made use of the abundant waterways in the New York region for fishing, hunting trips, trade, and occasionally war. Many paths created by the indigenous peoples are now main thoroughfares, such as Broadway in Manhattan, the Bronx, and Westchester. The Lenape developed sophisticated techniques of hunting and managing their resources. By the time of the arrival of Europeans, they were cultivating fields of vegetation through the slash and burn technique, which extended the productive life of planted fields. They also harvested vast quantities of fish and shellfish from the bay. Historians estimate that at the time of European settlement, approximately 5,000 Lenape lived in 80 settlements around the region. European exploration and settlement, edit. New Angoulême, edit. New Angoulême redirects here. For the place in French Guiana, see Anne-Marie Javouhet. The first European visitor to the area was Giovanni the Verrazzano, an Italian in command of the French ship La Dauphine in 1524. It is believed he sailed into Upper New York Bay, where he encountered native Lenape, returned through the Narrows, where he anchored the night of the 17th of April, and left to continue his voyage. He named the area New Angoulême, La Nouvelle Angoulême, in honor of Francis I, King of France of the royal house of Valois-Angoulême and who had been Count of Angoulême from 1496 until his coronation in 1515. The name refers to the town of Angoulême, in the Charente department of France. For the next century, the area was occasionally visited by fur traders or explorers, such as by Esteban Gomez in 1525. European exploration continued on the 2nd of September, 1609, when the Englishman Henry Hudson, in the employ of the Dutch East India Company, sailed the Half Moon through the Narrows into Upper New York Bay. Like Christopher Columbus, Hudson was looking for a westerly passage to Asia. He never found one, but he did take note of the abundant beaver population. Beaver pelts were in fashion in Europe, fueling a lucrative business. Hudson's report on the regional beaver population served as the impetus for the founding of Dutch trading colonies in the New World. The beaver's importance in New York's history is reflected by its use on the city's official seal. Dutch settlement, edit. Main article, New Amsterdam. The first Dutch fur trading posts and settlements were in 1614 near present-day Albany, New York, the same year that New Netherland first appeared on maps. Only in May 1624 did the Dutch West India Company land a number of families at Noten-Eiland, today's Governor's Island, off the southern tip of Manhattan at the mouth of the North River, today's Hudson River. Soon thereafter, most likely in 1626, construction of Fort Amsterdam began. Later, the Dutch West Indies Company imported African slaves to serve as laborers. They were forced to build the wall that defended the town against English and Indian attacks. Early directors included Willem Verhulst and Peter Minuit. Willem Kieft became director in 1638 but 5 years later was embroiled in Kieft's war against the Native Americans. The Pavania Massacre, across the Hudson River in present-day Jersey City, resulted in the death of 80 natives in February 1643. Following the massacre, Algonquian tribes joined forces and nearly defeated the Dutch. Holland sent additional forces to the aid of Kieft, leading to the overwhelming defeat of the Native Americans and a peace treaty on the 29th of August, 1645. On the 27th of May, 1647, Peter Stuyvesant was inaugurated as Director General upon his arrival and ruled as a member of the Dutch Reformed Church. The colony was granted self-government in 1652, and New Amsterdam was incorporated as a city on the 2nd of February, 1653. The first mayors, burgemeesters, of New Amsterdam, Arend van Hattem and Martin Cregier, were appointed in that year. By the early 1660s, the population consisted of approximately 1,500 Europeans, only about half of whom were Dutch, and 375 Africans, 300 of whom were slaves. A few of the original Dutch place names have been retained, most notably Flushing, after the Dutch town of Vlissingen, Haarlem, after Haarlem, and Brooklyn, after Broekelen. Few buildings, however, remain from the 17th century. The oldest recorded house still in existence in New York, the Pieter Claesen Wyckoff House in Brooklyn, dates from 1652. English Rule, 1664-1783, edit. On the 27th of August, 1664, 4 English frigates under the command of Colonel Richard Nichols sailed into New Amsterdam's harbour and demanded New Netherland's surrender, as part of an effort by King Charles II's brother James, Duke of York, the Lord High Admiral, to provoke the Second Anglo-Dutch War. 2 weeks later, Stuyvesant officially capitulated by signing Articles of Surrender, and in June, 1665, the town was reincorporated under English law and renamed New York after the Duke, and Fort Orange was renamed Fort Albany. The war ended in a Dutch victory in 1667, but the colony remained under English rule as stipulated in the Treaty of Breda. During the Third Anglo-Dutch War, the Dutch briefly recaptured the city in 1673, renaming the city New Orange, before permanently ceding the colony of New Netherland to England for what is now Suriname in November 1674 at the Treaty of Westminster. The colony benefited from increased immigration from Europe and its population grew faster. The Bolting Act of 1678, whereby no mill outside the city was permitted to grind wheat or corn, boosted growth until its repeal in 1694, increasing the number of houses over the period from 384 to 983. In the context of the Glorious Revolution in England, Jacob Leisler led Leisler's rebellion and effectively controlled the city and surrounding areas from 1689 to 1691, before being arrested and executed. Lawyers, edit. In New York at first, legal practitioners were full-time businessmen and merchants, with no legal training, who had watched a few court proceedings, and mostly used their own common sense together with snippets they had picked up about English law. Court proceedings were quite informal, for the judges had no more training than the attorneys. By the 1760s, the situation had dramatically changed. Lawyers were essential to the rapidly growing international trade, dealing with questions of partnerships, contracts, and insurance. The sums of money involved were large, and hiring an incompetent lawyer was a very expensive proposition. Lawyers were now professionally trained, and conversant in an extremely complex language that combined highly specific legal terms and motions with a dose of Latin. Court proceedings became a baffling mystery to the ordinary layman. Lawyers became more specialized and built their reputation, and their fee schedule, on the basis of their reputation for success. But as their status, wealth and power rose, animosity grew even faster. By the 1750s and 1760s, there was a widespread attack ridiculing and demeaning the lawyers as pettifoggers, lawyers lacking sound legal skills. Their image and influence declined. The lawyers organized a bar association, but it fell apart in 1768 during the bitter political dispute between the factions based in the Delancey and Livingston families. A large fraction of the prominent lawyers were loyalists. Their clientele was often to royal authority or British merchants and financiers. They were not allowed to practice law unless they took a loyalty oath to the new United States of America. Many went to Britain or Canada, primarily to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, after losing the war. For the next century, various attempts were made, and failed, to build an effective organization of lawyers. Finally, a bar association emerged in 1869 that proved successful and continues to operate. Native Americans and Enslaved People, edit. By 1700, the Lenape population of New York had diminished to 200. The Dutch West Indies Company transported African slaves to the post as trading laborers used to build the fort and stockade, and some gained freedom under the Dutch. After the seizure of the colony in 1664, the slave trade continued to be legal. In 1703, 42% of the New York households had slaves. They served as domestic servants and laborers but also became involved in skilled trades, shipping and other fields. Yet following reform in ethics according to American Enlightenment thought, by the 1770s slaves made up less than 25% of the population. By the 1740s, 20% of the residents of New York were slaves, totaling about 2,500 people. After a series of fires in 1741, the city panicked over rumors of its black population conspiring with some poor whites to burn the city. Historians believe their alarm was mostly fabrication and fear, but officials rounded up 31 black and 4 white people, who over a period of months were convicted of arson. Of these, the city executed 13 black people by burning them alive and hanged the remainder of those incriminated. In 1754, Columbia University was founded under charter by King George II as King's College in Lower Manhattan. American Revolution, edit. The Stamp Act and other British measures fomented dissent, particularly among Sons of Liberty who maintained a long-running skirmish with locally stationed British troops over Liberty Poles from 1766 to 1776. The Stamp Act Congress met in New York City in 1765 in the first organized resistance to British authority across the colonies. After the major defeat of the Continental Army in the Battle of Long Island in late 1776, General George Washington withdrew to Manhattan Island, but with the subsequent defeat at the Battle of Fort Washington, the island was effectively left to the British. The city became a haven for Loyalist refugees, becoming a British stronghold for the entire war. Consequently, the area also became the focal point for Washington's espionage and intelligence gathering throughout the war. New York was greatly damaged twice by fires of suspicious origin, with the Loyalists and Patriots accusing each other of starting the conflagration. The city became the political and military center of operations for the British in North America for the remainder of the war. Continental Army officer Nathan Hale was hanged in Manhattan for espionage. In addition, the British began to hold the majority of captured American prisoners of war aboard prison ships in Walleebout Bay, across the East River in Brooklyn. More Americans lost their lives aboard these ships than died in all the battles of the war. The British occupation lasted until the 25th of November, 1783. George Washington triumphantly returned to the city that day, as the last British forces left the city. Federal and Early America, 1784-1854, edit. Main article, History of New York City, 1784-1854. Starting in 1785, the Congress met in the city of New York under the Articles of Confederation. In 1789, New York became the first national capital under the new Constitution. The Constitution also created the current Congress of the United States, and its first sitting was at Federal Hall on Wall Street. The first Supreme Court sat there. The United States Bill of Rights was drafted and ratified there. George Washington was inaugurated at Federal Hall. New York remained the national capital until 1790, when the role was transferred to Philadelphia. During the 19th century, the city was transformed by immigration, a visionary development proposal called the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, which expanded the city street grid to encompass all of Manhattan, and the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, which connected the Atlantic port to the vast agricultural markets of the Midwestern United States and Canada. By 1835, New York had surpassed Philadelphia as the largest city in the United States. New York grew as an economic center, first as a result of Alexander Hamilton's policies and practices as the first Secretary of the Treasury. In 1842, water was piped from a reservoir to supply the city for the first time. The Great Irish Famine, 1845-1850, brought a large influx of Irish immigrants, and by 1850 the Irish comprised 1/4 of the city's population. Government institutions, including the New York City Police Department and the public schools, were established in the 1840s and 1850s to respond to growing demands of residents. In 1831, New York University was founded by U.S. Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin as a non-denominational institution surrounding Washington Square Park. Modern History, edit. Tammany and Consolidation, 1855-1897, edit. Main article, History of New York City, 1855-1897. This period started with the 1855 inauguration of Philando Wood as the first mayor from Tammany Hall. It was the political machine based among Irish Americans that controlled the local Democratic Party. It usually dominated local politics throughout this period and into the 1930s. Public-minded members of the merchant community pressed for a Central Park, which was opened to a design competition in 1857. It became the first landscape park in an American city. During the American Civil War, 1861-1865, the city was affected by its history of strong commercial ties to the South. Before the war, half of its exports were related to cotton, including textiles from upstate mills. Together with its growing immigrant population, which was angry about conscription, sympathies among residents were divided for both the Union and Confederacy at the outbreak of war. Tensions related to the war culminated in the draft riots of 1863 led by Irish Catholics, who attacked black neighborhood and abolitionist homes. Many blacks left the city and moved to Brooklyn. After the Civil War, the rate of immigration from Europe grew steeply, and New York became the first stop for millions seeking a new and better life in the United States, a role acknowledged by the dedication of the Statue of Liberty in 1886. King's Calligraphs of New York City, 1910. Early 20th century, 1898-1945, edit. Main article, History of New York City, 1898-1945. See also, List of former municipalities in New York City. From 1890 to 1930, the largest cities, led by New York, were the focus of international attention. The skyscrapers and tourist attractions were widely publicized. Suburbs were emerging as bedroom communities for commuters to the central city. San Francisco dominated the West, Atlanta dominated the South. Boston dominated New England, Chicago dominated the Midwest United States. New York City dominated the entire nation in terms of communications, trade, finance, popular culture, and high culture. More than a fourth of the 300 largest corporations in 1920 were headquartered here. In 1898, the modern city of New York was formed with the